To check and fix the geometry, let's start with some of the more simple sections first. The interior and the window frames will require a little bit more work, so let's start by checking the rings and this exterior facade section. So on this rings section, I'm going to drop in a group node, and we'll turn off this base group and turn on this include by edges and look for unshared edges. And we'll hook that up to the rings, get rid of that other templated geometry. And if you middle mouse on this group here, you'll see that this group 1 is giving us no selected prims. So there are no unshared edges in that geo. I'm going to just rename that group to keep it clean. We'll just call it unshared. So this geometry is fine to use and fracture as is. But if you remember, our shatter tool requires looping over each object individually by name in order to fracture each section one by one. So let's give each of these rings a name attribute, and we'll use our connectivity attribute once again. Once again, we'll set this to prims, drop in a primitive wrangle node, hook it up to the connectivity, call this set names, and in this wrangle node we'll say s at name equals, and I'll start by calling this piece underscore, and then we'll add that class value once again, I to a, I at class. Now it gets a little bit annoying setting this vex up by hand every single time. We've done this many times, and we'll do this many more. So for this sort of thing, it's really helpful to set up a preset. If you go to the gear icon here, it looks like I've already set it up there, and you can go to Save Preset, give it a name, click Save, and then you'll have that option always available. In this case, I've already done it, so I can just go to that gear icon and say Names from Class, and it will automatically set that up for me. However, it's really good to use descriptive names whenever possible instead of just piece, so I'll change this to be called rings. And let's just do a quick check in our spreadsheet to see if our name attribute looks right, and looks like we are all good. We have rings 0 through 14. Now let's use this group node again to check that exterior facade. And this one looks like this also has no unshared edges, so we can just copy that same rename setup. So just paste in another copy of that. And the set names here, I'll change this to be facade instead. So we've got our rings, we've got our facade, and now let's check this BLK metal geometry. If you hook up the group to that, you can see this one is selecting, it looks like all the geo. And if you zoom in closer, then you can see sure enough this is just basic planar geometry. Switch it to wire on shaded. So this is not going to fracture cleanly. Sometimes you can fracture geometry that's planar. In the Boolean shatter settings, you can specify both A and B as surfaces instead of solids. And I'll sometimes do this with complex vehicle geometry, for example. Rather than fix all of the complicated parts of a vehicle, I might just fracture them as surfaces, and then I may extrude them, or I may just simulate them as surfaces if it looks like they have a little bit of shape so that they're not just flat planes. But in our case, it's easy enough to fix this geometry with a quick extrusion. Let's pull our group unshared check off to the side and drop in a poly extrude. Connect that to this second ring set here. And we can set the distance to, let's try, minus 0.1. And that looks like a pretty decent thickness for this piece of geom, but it by default does not have the back face turned on. So in the extrude settings, turn on output back, and we can test that resulting geometry with our group node. And now we can see there are no unshared edges anymore. However, I know I said that I often don't check the normals, until I start running into fracture problems. Well, one exception to that is when you're doing an extrusion like this, because just from experience I know that when you do a negative extrusion, it can do some weird things with the normals. They can often point inwards. So if you display normals here, it's kind of hard to tell with them so long, but if you go inside here, we have the normals pointing inwards on the surface. It looks correct from the outside. If you, in your display settings, shrink down your normals, you'll see though that it's just coming from inside the geometry and passing through to the outside. So we can fix this with a reverse node. So drop in the reverse and display that. And you can see that we don't have the problem with the normals going through the geom anymore. This vertical normal through there is just coming from this lower surface. So if we want to see that a bit more cleanly, we can go to our display settings and guides and scale down the normals quite a bit and close that. And you can see that now our normals are all good. However, even though the normals are correct, sometimes this reverse does some kind of weird things to them, and usually after doing a reverse, I will drop in a new normal node just to get those normals looking correct. You can see before we have this kind of strange black shading going on there, and dropping in that new normal node gives us a much more nicely shaded surface. So now that this section of geometry is fixed, let's grab that naming setup from the first set of rings and paste it down here for the second set of rings. Connect our fixed geometry to that, go to that naming wrangle node there, and let's just give this a different name. We'll call that rings B. And now we're all good on these sections of geometry.